Bella."
A soft, high-pitched whisper alerted me to Alice. My jaw clenched as I squeezed his waist tighter. I heard the same sigh from behind me once again.
"I'm really sorry,"
she apologized in a voice that seeped with genuine regret. I was going to answer before I felt Edward sigh deeply and grip my hair tighter in his hand.
"Take a fucking picture, Hale."
He spat to the space behind me, where I assumed Rose was standing with Alice. I grimaced, realizing that they were likely gaping at Edward and making him uncomfortable after learning the truth about his past. "I'll be home in a minute," I mumbled into his shoulder quickly, willing them to leave before he got suspicious of their actions. The foyer was quiet for a few moments before I could hear them shuffling towards the door and exiting quietly. I sighed into Edward's chest as I loosened my grip around his waist and pulled away to look at his face apologetically. "Sorry to just barge over here," I mumbled regretfully while he eyed me cautiously. He rolled his eyes and shook his head at me.
"That's bullshit. You can come over whenever you want."
He removed one of his hands from my curls to gently wipe away the remaining tears from my cheek with his thumb as he gazed down at me lovingly. The love in his eyes erased most of the bitter aftertaste, but I needed one more thing before I could go back home and face those two. So I bounced up on my tiptoes and pressed my lips to his, moving my arms from his waist to wrap around his neck tightly as I crushed my lips to his firmly. He hummed, tangling his hands into my hair and moving against my lips in a soft and sweet kiss. I smiled against his lips as the small gesture made me feel impossibly better. He smiled back against my lips and pulled away, turning his head around the foyer and glancing over his shoulder before turning back to me and using one hand to sweep the hair from my neck. My breath hitched as he leaned into my neck and planted a soft kiss right below my ear.
"By the way,"
he breathed into my neck, trailing his lips up to my ear and grazing my earlobe.
"you look so fucking sexy in that skirt."
He whispered seductively into my ear, while he used his hand to bunch my curls into his palm. I bit back a moan at his seductive tone, as my eyes fluttered closed. Sexy? Not adorable. I was going to kiss all the way up his neck relentlessly before I felt him pull away from me. I opened my eyes to meet his sparkling gaze as his lips slowly turned up into a smirk and we released each other. I smiled back widely before I turned to exit, deciding that skirts were the most genius article of clothing Satan himself had ever invented. Even though I felt bad about storming over to the Cullen house unannounced, I was thankful that I felt better and I wouldn't have to spoil our night with my awful mood. When I got home, I went straight to Elisa's room. In reality, we had both overreacted because we cared greatly about two different people. And that was the gist of the whole argument. Alice just cared about me, and she didn't know Edward well enough to trust him with that piece of my innocence. I supposed if I had been in her shoes I might have had a similar reaction. I was wondering how she would react if she knew how shamelessly I had been throwing myself at him for the last 2 months. When I reached her open doorway, her head snapped up from Rose's shoulder where they sat on her bed. My face fell when I realized she had been crying. She sniffled as she gazed up at me with wide remorseful brown eyes from the edge of the bed where she sat. I sighed as my shoulders slumped and I shuffled my way to her bed, flopping down beside her and throwing my arms around her neck wordlessly. She pivoted toward me and returned the embrace strongly, her little arms nearly crushing my ribs as she sniffled into my shoulder.
"I'm so sorry, Bella. I didn't mean it,"
she apologized sadly, squeezing me harder. I attempted to sigh. "It's okay." I forgave her in a strained voice as her constriction of my torso became nearly painful. She sniffled softly and loosened her grip slightly without letting me go. Rose sighed from the opposite side of her, gaining my attention as I eyed her from over Elisa's shoulder.
"Yep,"
Rose stated in an uncomfortable tone, while picking at her long manicured nails.
"I guess I am too."
She shrugged one shoulder indifferently as she stared intently at her hand. I smiled at Rose's attempt at an apology and quickly forgave her as well. It really was like being a normal girl for a day. Boys, gossip, hair and cleavage, bickering, and awkward apologies, and all. We all lounged on the bed, after that, scooting up to the headboard while Alice rested her head on my shoulder and I rested my head on hers. Rose continued flipping through the pages of her magazine as we all remained quiet for a few moments. Elisa's hand found mine resting on the pretty red skirt as she grabbed it inside her smaller hand.
Did all that stuff really happen to him?
She whispered softly, playing with my fingers as I stared at one of the posters on her wall, and nodded curtly, hoping she wouldn't inquire any further into his past. I was already feeling guilty enough, as it was. She shook her head against my shoulder, tickling my ear with her spiky black hair.
That's just awful.
She breathed sadly, as she stroked my hand with her thumb. I didn't say anything regarding how awful it actually was, as the room was filled in a grim and stifling silence. I figured we were all likely considering the events of Edward's traumatic childhood. It was one of those defining moments, where the mood of the entire day could be completely and utterly spoiled by the cloud hanging over the situation. God bless Rosalie. She huffed, and tossed the magazine across the room, startling Alice and I, as we shifted our attention to her.
This is why I never talk to girls about blowjobs.
She spoke in annoyance as she darted her eyes back and forth between us.
Someone always ends up crying and running away from me.
She sniffed indignantly. Alice and I both stared at her blankly for a moment. And then we both began snorting and chuckling at her statement, as she rolled her eyes and relaxed back against the headboard, victorious in dissipating the gloomy atmosphere. We picked up where we left off as Alice shooed me into the vanity seat and resumed curling my hair. In an attempt to give Rose a better experience, I boldly brought up the subject of fellatio once again while staring intently at my lap. Alice grinned and shook her head at a lock of my hair as Rose enthusiastically explained the entire disgusting process to me. I was possibly a little more interested in the whole thing than entirely necessary. I was quite sure I could never do the thing she was describing to Edward. He had only been able to grope me without using the safe word for a week. I was still working up the nerve to do something as brave as removing my shirt so he would touch my skin again. After Rose had smugly described her every seductive tongue technique in excruciating detail, and a few other specifics that I couldn't even repeat in my mind without turning the shade of my clothing, I sat completely silent in the vanity seat, awestruck and more than a little appalled as I gazed at her wide-eyed through the mirror. Rose and I were both quite pleased when Alice merely snickered at her lesson while doing my hair and shaking her head. She didn't object to me knowing about it, and she certainly didn't seem surprised by the details given. Neither of us ran away crying, though I must admit, the instinct to do so was definitely there. As me arrived home at 4, scurrying around the house hastily as Rose, Alice, and I all eyed her curiously from where we sat in the living room. They had somehow talked me into a Valentine's Day movie marathon while waiting for 6 o'clock to arrive so they could both go spend the night with their respective significant others. It was quite classic, the plan they had concocted. Rose was sleeping at our house. Alice was sleeping at hers. Or at least that's what their parents thought. The only explanation